This presentation is being brought to you by the Southern University Ag Center, Southern University Intramural Sports, Southern University and A&M College, and the Southern University Counseling Center.
Hi everyone, my name is Devin Leivo and I am a pre-doctoral intern with the University Counseling Center at Southern University in Baton Rouge. And today I'm going to be giving you all a little bit of information about grief and how to manage it, especially during this COVID-19 time. COVID-19 has impacted a lot of communities, including the Southern University community, and there are many people who have lost loved ones to coronavirus. So we are hoping that by providing this information, those of you who have lost somebody due to COVID-19 or who know people who are going through the grief process can benefit from some of this information. So let's get started. So symptoms of grief. Now, some of these are pretty self-explanatory, like sadness and crying. These are things that, are expected when we lose someone close to us, when we lose a loved one. Some of these are not so self-explanatory, so I'm just going to kind of go through some of them that are maybe a little less known and kind of explain a little bit about them. So for example, concentration or memory problems. When we experience high emotionality like we tend to when we're grieving, that can impair our ability to concentrate or remember information. And unfortunately, that is often linked to poor school performance and job performance in times of grief. Sleep and appetite changes are common. Everyone's a little bit different, so sometimes people may be sleeping more while others sleep less. Others may have an increase in appetite while another person might have a decrease in appetite, but significant changes in sleep and appetite is a symptom of grief. Social isolation. So what I mean by this is people who are grieving and going through the grief process often tend to withdraw from other people, kind of feeling alone and wanting to be alone, which is kind of natural for people to want to do that. However, it doesn't necessarily help the process. So that's something to look out for if you see someone who you know is grieving, kind of pulling away and isolating a lot, or if you yourself have lost someone and find yourself alone, that's a symptom of grief. It's not uncommon for people who are religious to begin kind of questioning God or their faith, kind of the question of why did this happen to this particular person that I love? They were a good person, and really starting to kind of question, what's going on there with God and with your religion and your faith and things like that. Another common symptom that we see is substance use, like alcohol use or drug use, or other risky behaviors people start engaging in to kind of dull the pain that they're experiencing as a result of losing a loved one. So if you kind of notice that someone is drinking more, or they start using drugs or doing other things that are kind of high risk, that may be an attempt to kind of dull some of that pain that they're experiencing. And intrusive thoughts of the lost loved one. What I mean by intrusive thoughts is that you kind of have these random almost thoughts about the person that you've lost pop into your head, and they seem like they come kind of out of nowhere. And they can often be distressing because they may pop in at times where you're trying to not think about it or you're trying to focus on something else. So again, these thoughts can be highly distressing and cause like the crying and things like that. Now, this list is not an exhaustive list of symptoms, but these are some of the common ones that we tend to see. The Kubler-Ross stages of grief. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist, and she was a pioneer of near-death studies. And she came up with a 5-stage model of the grief process. And I'll kind of walk through each step of the stage briefly and kind of explain what we tend to see at each stage. So the first stage is denial. And in the denial stage, this is usually right around when the loved one is first lost. So it may not seem like the loss is actually real, and the loss may be experienced almost as like a sense of numbness and an inability to really accept what happened. Again, like I said, it almost doesn't feel real. And this stage, we think, may exist to kind of protect the individual who lost someone from the very intense part of losing somebody, because that is a very intense experience to lose someone you're close with. After denial, we tend to see people go into what's called the anger stage. And this is when that numbness and that sense of unreality about the loss starts to wear off, and the person starts to really feel intense pain that is often expressed through anger. So the person may lash out at people and seem very irritable during this period. And it's not uncommon for the person that is grieving and in the stage of anger to want to search to place blame on someone or something else for the loss of their loved one. Sometimes they may even feel intense guilt, and like I said, they may lash out at other people during this stage. The next stage after anger is the bargaining stage, and we call this the what if stage. So a lot of questions like, well, if this had happened, would the person I love would they have died? Would they still be here if something else had different? A lot of questioning and dwelling on what could have prevented the loss at this time. And some people who are highly religious may even try to kind of make a deal or bargain with a higher power in order to have that loved one brought back. So for example, someone may, while they're praying, say, God, if you bring back my grandmother or you bring back my mother, I won't ask you for anything else ever again. I'll attend church every Sunday. We tend to see things like that in the bargaining stage. After the bargaining stage is depression. And this is when the grieving person really starts to experience like that low emotional state that is very similar to clinical depression, but a little bit different. And this tends to happen when the reality of the loss like really sinks in for the person, like it really starts to become real. And at this time, people tend to experience really intense sadness, loss of motivation. This is where you tend to see the sleep and appetite disturbance also become really common. And loneliness feelings are also common at this time. And then the final stage is the acceptance stage. So this is when the person really fully starts to accept the reality of the loss and recognize that there's permanence in the loss of their loved one. And this is also a time where people are beginning to be able to integrate a wide range of emotions surrounding the loss of their loved one. And this is where the healing really starts to occur in this final stage. So ways to cope with grief. This slide is really directed towards people who are themselves experiencing grief and going through the grieving process, having lost a loved one. One of the best things that you can do is try to connect with other people who have experienced loss themselves, because not only does that protect against the social isolation that I talked about earlier, but it also provides a kind of a sense of community of people who kind of understand what you're going through and have experienced similar things that may be able to support you in a way that others who haven't experienced a loss may not be able to fully do. Another thing is to seek out counseling services. You can seek these out at the University Counseling Center here at Southern. The therapists are trained in how to help individuals who are grieving process their grief and kind of move through those stages we just talked about. Another way to cope with grief is to write about the person who has passed or even write a letter to them. And this is actually a technique, the letter writing, that we use in therapy sometimes. And we find it especially helpful for people who are experiencing grief due to a loss that feel like they never got to have closure or feel like they have something that they still need to say to that person. And it can actually be quite powerful and cathartic for the person to actually be able to get what they wanted to say to that person out and kind of get some closure. Pursuing new interests and spending time with friends, again, that kind of helps protect against the social isolation. And it also gives you an opportunity to kind of put some of your energy somewhere else so you're not constantly dwelling on the loss. Talking about grief with those that you trust, again, that's protecting against social isolation, and it also just provides kind of a sense of support to have someone there to listen to you and things like that. Engaging in activities that provide a sense of normalcy. So a loss can really kind of upset your normal routine and your normal daily activities. And kind of getting back to that sense of normalcy by engaging in things that you typically would before the person passed kind of helps almost move you back toward a sense of normal. Maintaining a sense of community, again, combats the social isolation. And this can be done through volunteering, outreach, getting involved with church services and other religious related services and things like that. Also, just kind of creating a support system and an outlet for some of the energy that you might be spending on the dwelling. Not that we necessarily want to forget about the person, but we don't want to constantly be dwelling on the loss. Creating art is also a great way to express grief, similar to the writing of the letter. Art is a really great way to get out what we want to say or communicate without when we don't actually have the words to do so. And then just educating oneself about the grief process. This is a way to do it, this presentation that I'm doing, but just making sure that you have the information about grief and the process of grieving kind of helps contextualize what you're experiencing, and kind of just put into, I guess, scope what the process may look like for you and what you're experiencing. Supporting others through the grief process. So this slide is more directed towards somebody who may have a friend or a family member that is grieving the loss of somebody and they want to be able to support them the best they can. The biggest thing is just listen. Listening to the person is very powerful. It's okay if you don't know the exact words or how to, exactly respond to what they're saying, but just having someone there to listen to them is very helpful and very powerful, especially because a lot of people who are grieving are kind of hesitant to talk about their sadness and their grief because they don't want to be a downer or feel like they're bringing people down. So it's really important to have that space just to let them talk and you listen. And again, that kind of goes with the next bullet. Encourage the expression of grief. Encourage the person to express what they're feeling, because bottling up the emotions inside of us and not letting them have an outlet can actually make things worse. And you want to create a safe environment where the person can talk to you openly about the loss, meaning you want this to be kind of a judgment-free zone that's kind of free of distractions, where you can really give your attention to the person when they talk to you about these things. Because it's already difficult to talk about, and it's not always pleasant for them to talk about, but it's necessary. And ask questions and discuss the past loved one if the person who lost their loved one thinks that is going to be helpful. Again, sharing information about the grief process just so the person can kind of understand, what they're experiencing in the context of grief and things like that. Assisting in practical and concrete ways. This is an important one. And I think especially for students, because when a loss occurs, oftentimes there's missed classes and things like that. So a practical way for one student to support another student who has lost someone is to be like, hey, I know that you missed class. Let me send you my notes so you don't fall too far behind, or like, let's go over the notes together. That's a concrete way of helping somebody. Or even if someone's having trouble, cooking for themselves because they're very, depressed and grieving very hard, you can be like, hey, I cooked you something to eat, I'm bringing it over. Just ways of taking care of someone that's very concrete. Also really important, really try to avoid expressing pity for the person who is grieving or minimizing the loss by saying things like, oh, it could have been worse, or things like that. That's not very helpful, and sometimes it can be seen as kind of patronizing and invalidating. And finally, share information about support groups or other resources. So if you know about a support group that might be helpful to that person, share that information with them. It might be helpful to them. And speaking of resources, here's a few that we've put together for resources and support. Actively Moving Forward is an app that you can get on Android and iPhone, and it's for mainly ages 18 to 30. So this is for mainly your emergent and young adults. So the student population at Southern would kind of fall into the Actively Moving Forward app age group, and that might be most helpful to them. Grief Anonymous is another one. It's kind of similar in structure to Alcoholics Anonymous, except the focus is grief and not alcoholism. And they provide in-person support meetings. At this time, I don't know exactly what that looks like with COVID-19, but they also offer online support groups through Facebook that you can connect with other people who are experiencing loss. OnlineGriefSupport.com also has online social support groups, and it's kind of in like a forum format. And then What'sYourGrief.com is really great for getting information about grief and the process of grieving. They offer e-courses, podcasts, and webinars on the topic of grief and how to move through the stages and things like that. And then another source of support is speaking with religious or spiritual leaders. And this is our last slide, but in case anyone is interested in getting more information on grief, I provided information on the books that we pulled some of this information from for this particular presentation. So if you're interested, you can go and get connected with these books and look a little bit more. And if you are experiencing grief and you have concerns about, how you're managing it, or just want more information, or maybe just a little bit of extra support, please reach out to the University Counseling Center. Our contact information, phone and email address is listed right here. And if you call and no one answers, please leave a message. We will call you back. I hope this information has been helpful to you all, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.